Okay, and welcome everyone to Celebrating with Collections, specifically a special edition of Celebrating with Collections designed to help with some last minute preservation reminders for the 250th. My name is Jessie Keel. I'm an Associate Preservation Specialist here at NEDCC, and I'm excited to speak with you all today about the things that we can keep in mind as we approach any anniversary. And we'll spend a little bit of time today, thinking of the lens of the 250th and all the events that it's sort of bringing with it this summer. So with that, um, I'm going to kind of start with a little introduction of NEDCC. But while I introduce NEDCC, if you all want to introduce yourselves in the chat, please feel free to chime in the chat, where you're coming from, your organization, anything like that that you want to share. It's just nice to sort of see who's in the room. And I think what's been interesting about this big national anniversary is sort of the different perspectives that are sort of coming from all over the country. So please feel free to chime in the chat. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about NEDCC, just in case, any of you are not familiar, although I am hoping that if you found this webinar, you know a little bit about the great resources that we offer. But we're the oldest regional conservation center in the United States. The actual center is based in Andover, Massachusetts, which is just north of Boston. So that is where I'm speaking to you all from today. And in our labs here in Andover, we provide conservation treatments for paper-based materials, including books and photographs, as well as audio reformatting services. We also do imaging services. And then again, I'm a preservation specialist. So I'm part of our preservation services department. So if you've ever watched a webinar with us before or used one of our online free resources, it is my department and me who help make all of those things happen. And so we will go out and do assessments. We teach these webinars and help provide preservation advice to organizations of all shapes and sizes all over the country. So that's a little bit about the work we do. And if you want to know more, obviously you can go to our website. I'm seeing a lot of folks chiming in here in the chat. I just want to do a quick look. Okay, we got folks from Massachusetts, from Pennsylvania, California. Again, keep feeling free to throw an introduction there. I just want to review our agenda today. We have a couple different things that we're going to cover as we approach this topic of anniversaries. I really like to start with sort of looking at the risk benefit analysis around how we approach any sort of anniversary celebration. I think it's a really good reminder of how we need to be thinking about the preservation of our collections ahead of these big moments, 250th and other ones. And then we'll use that lens to start thinking about my favorite thing to talk about, which is policies and documentation, and how we can sort of use that to help focus in any last minute plans that you may be trying to put together. We'll then do a handling refresher. This, for a lot of you, maybe again, just like totally, information you already know by heart about how to handle collections safely. But it is also a really good opportunity for volunteers, interns, anyone that you maybe need to be refreshing themselves. Maybe you have an increased volunteership at this point in time. This is a great way to help refresh them as well. I have a short case study from the Alabama Bicentennial of a great example of how, an anniversary got celebrated. And then at the end, it's very practical. We have a checklist that I want to look through with you all. And then I'm hoping to, at the end of the session today, have some good time for brainstorming and giving you all a little bit of time to jumpstart any planning that you have around anniversaries. I do want to highlight that this webinar, is going to cover a lot of information, as I've just said, with the agenda, but it's not an event planning webinar. So, there's a lot of resources I'll point you to. Like, for example, AASLH has put together, a really robust workbook to help you all as you're planning specific programming and events. So there's great resources for you to reference out there. My focus is today is as you plan these events, what are the preservation things that we should be keeping in mind, whether that's an event we're trying to plan for next week, or whether you're planning for, your organization's upcoming 100th anniversary that's not for another 2 years. So with that, I want to get started. I'm going to check the chat again, though. I'm really curious. We have more Massachusetts, Ohio, Virginia, Connecticut. Wonderful. So many great locations. Um, And I guess I should have asked this when you did your introductions, but I'm also curious to hear, are folks really just focused in on the 250th right now, or do you have other anniversaries that you're preparing for? So if you have any sort of information you want to share about what anniversary you're preparing for, I'd be curious to hear because I know 250th is sort of top of mind, but it obviously also coincides with a lot of other different types of historical anniversaries, and the founding of towns, the founding of organizations and things like that. So feel free to include that in the chat as well. I'm sure everybody here in this room would love to sort of understand where folks are coming from and what they're trying to work on. So to get started, right, I want to kind of think about why this is even a topic of conversation, right? What can be gained from celebrating an anniversary? And I think an anniversary can really be a moment of celebration or commemoration that allows us to reflect on the people, the work, the events that have had an impact on society and culture, both kind of within a very small specific community, but also nationwide. And I think for cultural heritage organizations, anniversaries can be particularly powerful because they can lead to an increased interest and a deeper engagement with the collections that, we always know how exciting and special our collections are, but anniversaries can be an opportunity to really shine a light on those things. And obviously, local anniversaries happen all the time. I think there's been an increase in a lot of this conversation and programming around the 250th. But again, we've just, there's some examples here on screen of some major anniversaries that have happened in the last, 5 or so years. Whether they are, nationwide historic moments, right? Like the centennial of the 19th Amendment. The Boston Tea Party, right, was, a big celebration here in the Massachusetts area. But there's a lot of different kinds of anniversaries. I know we here at NEDCC just a few years ago celebrated our 50th anniversary. And so that was something we thought a lot about. So there are a lot of great models, right, for how other organizations have celebrated big milestones or how they're approaching a big nationwide event like the 250th. And so, of course, why does this say 2020? Yeah, okay. So 2026, I'm like losing track of what year we're in. So the United States semi-quincentennial, I don't think anyone here is not aware that it's the 250th this year. And I know if you're like me, you probably got burned out on 250th kind of content and webinars and workshops and conferences 2 years ago, maybe last year. Last year was when I sort of hit my I can't think about the 250th anymore, and the anniversary hadn't even come yet. I think, it's positive that the cultural heritage field had embraced planning for the 250th so early. But what I think embracing it early can also do is cause early burnout on the anniversary. And so, I think there are some organizations, and I sort of felt this way. I stopped thinking about it for a little while, and that means we are now in this sort of last minute crunch of, oh yeah, you thought about it so much that you then stopped thinking about it. And now we're here in the 250th year. And approaching that July 4th sort of holiday, but I think there's going to be programming all year round for this year. And so I want to help kind of empower everyone to say, okay, there are still, you can still pursue a project and keep preservation front of mind, even if you are doing a little bit more of a last minute celebration. So with that sort of introduction, I'm going to check the chat again. Again, curious. Okay, so we're celebrating a town anniversary. That's interesting. We got folks from Texas, somebody from Vermont. That's exciting. I'm from Vermont originally, so I love that. Okay, well, thanks for everyone for chiming in. We'll be, please feel free to drop questions in the chat because I will pause periodically to look there. So let's get started talking about the risks and benefits, right? I just sort of introduced the topic, talked about that big benefit, right? But I want to get specific about how we want to be approaching the risks and the opportunities that come with this moment in time. And as I already said, right, increased attention that can come around a major anniversary or a national event like the 250th is likely, depending on your collection, going to mean an increase in research and media requests, events, exhibits, just more handling of your collections in general. And so, while that's all very exciting, from a preservation standpoint, we are worried about the risk of damage, theft, loss of content, And so I want to just sort of shine a light on those risks. I think the biggest one, of course, comes with exhibiting your collections. That's going to be the most common thing that folks are planning around any major anniversary celebration, which is makes sense, right? We want to, find the items in our collections that really, relate to that anniversary that can really show folks um, what you have and really create a compelling story. So there's some great examples on screen, but we know that with exhibits, there's a lot more handling as we install, deinstall materials. There's just more opportunity for wear and tear, exposure to elements. And so, especially approaching something like an exhibit, we really want a lot of time and attention that goes into the planning so that things are protected during that process. And so the common theme that we'll sort of be negotiating throughout this webinar is that balance between preservation, making sure we're doing this as safely as possible for our collections, while also providing that access that's so key to this anniversary moment. So I want to run through a couple risks related to display. I think there are sort of like four major risks when it comes to exhibiting collections, particularly. And we'll go kind of through each of them. None of this is to say, and I want to be super clear that I'm saying don't exhibit your items. That's, not at all what we think. We just want to make sure we're one, communicating to any sort of stakeholders at your organization. Um, the risks involved so that, everybody who's involved with this project understands that it has to be done thoughtfully. I know there can be pressure from boards or directors to just like, oh, can't you just like throw an exhibit together? How hard could that be? Without understanding why so much care and attention goes into the planning of something like that. Um, and so we just want to be really thoughtful about how we approach this in terms of mitigating the sort of four major ones here, which are light, chemical damage, mechanical damage, and theft and vandalism. So let's look at each one of those more closely. Um, Light is sort of one of the most obvious ones, I think. This is really the biggest risks to collection materials on view, right? All light is damaging, and light damage is cumulative and irreversible. So light damage, it can be really simple, right? And something you barely even notice, right? Like maybe a book spine sort of changing color. And that's what one of the pictures we're seeing here on screen. It can also be really, really extreme. Um, there were these Mark Rothko murals at Harvard, which were on display from kind of constantly from 1964 to 1979, in an area where they were constantly exposed to sunlight, which is particularly damaging. And so there was a lot of, considerations on how to then bring those back to life. And then, basically putting them into storage for over 35 years because they had been so damaged by that light exposure. So there can be really serious damage done to materials. So intensity, aside from fading, there's can also be, additional physical and chemical damage to the structure of materials, depending on the material. Intensity and long exposure times can, of course, lead to fading, changing colors. Ultraviolet radiation in particular, right? The UV light coming from the sun is going to lead to weakening, bleaching, and yellowing of paper and other organic materials. And so all of these changes we know will diminish the readability, the kind of aesthetic appreciation of artwork in the case of the murals, and can, of course, impact the information that is contained within these materials. So in the resource guide that goes with this, there's a link to kind of, if you want to read more about the Rothko murals, I think it's an interesting kind of example. So we have light. The next one is chemical damage. This is another risk when we're pulling collection items out of storage. Materials are often framed to be put on display or put on exhibit in cases. And so if you're using acidic matting or other non-chemically inert materials, they can interact with the original materials and cause serious chemical damage. So that's what we're seeing here on screen. You can see all of that speckled foxing that was caused by an acidic mat being on top of this image. You can even see this very distinct line here around the image. That's the matte burn. again, from an acidic material. And this can also happen in exhibit cases that weren't designed to exhibit archival materials. We've visited historical societies that have used refurbished cigar cases and jewelry cases to exhibit materials, which is like very neat and creative, don't get me wrong. But they there can be really harmful things coming off the wood varnish in those cases. The other thing we're worried about is mechanical damage. This one's also pretty, I think, obvious when we think about it. It's that increased handling as we put items out on display, as we, work with them with researchers. Any amount of movement and handling comes with that risk of mechanical damage. So there's some examples here of mechanical damage that can occur, you know, pretty obvious one is, not putting a thumbtack through your photographs to display. And again, I'm sure it's unlikely to happen, but something, you can think about book spines being damaged from opening, or being held at the wrong angle. Excessive weight being put on things or, photographs becoming curled. All of those are things that we're trying to avoid. And then finally, while definitely not as frequent, I think it's worth mentioning the risk of theft and vandalism. The image you're seeing on the left is from the very famous theft at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, where 13 high-value works were stolen in 1990, have yet to be recovered. I'm sure all of you are aware of this instance. If you are not somehow possibly not aware of this, it's definitely worth reading about on their website. That's a super dramatic example, as is the other picture, which is a Monet that was punched in the National Gallery of Ireland. So I've picked two very dramatic examples, not to say that you're worried about priceless artwork being stolen or vandalized necessarily, but that with that increased visibility and visitation and display, kind of public display, there are always increased risks. And so being aware about your security policies, is definitely, especially, around an anniversary like the 250th, which, in some cases has been politicized, being very aware of the kind of context and community you're presenting to, and any security measures that you kind of normally have in place, or what extra security measures you might need ahead of a major exhibit, a major celebration like this. Because you want to keep your collection safe, you want to keep your visitors safe, all of those things. Um, One last thing I want to mention, again, that was really focused on exhibits. But of course, and I sort of hinted at this in some of this initial discussion, um, your collections are also, exhibits are not the only form of access. There is going to just be that increase in research requests and media coverage. Um, and access is so important, right? It's based usually, something based in your mission. It's something that, I'm sure your boards are excited about, administrators are excited about, granting agencies are going to be excited about. Um, and I want to kind of highlight here that relationship between preservation and access, right? These are two inseparable ideas. I've sort of already said that. But if we haven't preserved an item to last, we can't use it. We can't provide that access. And so that's just sort of the argument I think is really important to highlight, especially with your boards and things like that, that you're doing all of these things so that you can have this long-term access, that you can share items, to go in news articles, that you can, work with researchers who are doing interesting projects around these anniversaries. Um, and so making sure you're ready to deal with this influx of requests for collection access, making sure you have your forms, like your research forms, release forms for having press use images. All of these are things that can be really useful to ensuring that your collection is being accessed appropriately, while still getting to meet that higher demand. And so one way to approach that is, even now, again, ideally, right, especially something ahead of something like the 250th, you'd have a lot of time to consider, okay, what are going to be the high priority collections? Should we digitize them ahead of time to promote access? Should we do all of these things? You probably don't have time now to digitize a key collection that, folks might want to access in the 250th year. But what you can do is still do a little thought experiment about what the likely collections are. Maybe you've already been experiencing it as an uptick in requests have come in over this early part of the year. And so that for the next 6 months, they'll probably still have that level of access. And what are additional policies and procedures? What are some things you need to do to note the current condition of those materials that are being requested? All of those are things to think about ahead of time. Again, I don't want this to all be doom and gloom. I think anniversaries and this kind of celebration or commemoration can be really exciting. I want it to be something that's invigorating. So let's talk about the benefits, not just the risks, all of the good things that can come out of why you put in all of this effort around an anniversary celebration. And some, to be fair, might be a little bit obvious, but I think it's worth talking about. Obviously, there can just be an increase in advocacy. You have more conversations to have with donors, your board. Your board has something to have conversations about, with other folks in your community. It can also be an opportunity for grant and fundraising. I think grants are usually something that you sort of aim for pretty far ahead of an anniversary. And I think that was a big emphasis if you're, thinking about upcoming anniversaries, thinking about how that can fit into a grant narrative still makes sense. You're probably not applying for a 250th related grant this year. It's possible. Especially as we think about sort of the lasting kind of forward legacy of this anniversary. But it's definitely still an opportune moment to think about how you can work with donors and do fundraising around any anniversary, but I think particularly this one, because it has such like captured the national interest. Really thinking about how you can use that messaging to raise money for, critical preservation and care for your collections or building your collections. And sort of that ties to this overall, right, theme we've already hit on today of greater visibility for collections. Making sure that folks understand what you have and the role you can have in their community, the power of this historical record, all of those things. Anniversaries can also be a great opportunity for collaboration and partnerships. That's one of my favorite part. I love to see the organizations who are working together at these moments. This is also going to be key to reducing the workload. And so that's one thing I really wanted to highlight here, especially in terms of the last minute approach to the 250th. If you are still sort of like trying to put something together, you're definitely not alone, right? And so what are your other partner institutions that you can sort of jump onto a thing that they're already planning, something your state's already planning, maybe working with another either nearby organization, but it doesn't have to be nearby. I've seen partnerships that have happened between, similar institutions that are states apart, but have sort of organized and marketed their programming in a really interesting way. And so again, this is a point where there's a lot of great examples out there. So doing your research and kind of seeing what other folks are doing can be really useful or what they've done in the past. One example I really like is in 2023, it was the 50th anniversary of hip hop. There was a lot of organizations that were celebrating it. But I really liked that the St. Louis Art Museum, they were doing a series of local collaborations. They were doing a graffiti mural residency, like all of these things, but they were partnering with the Baltimore Museum of Art, right? So two art museums quite far apart. But they were doing a kind of shared exhibit called The Culture. And I thought that was such a great example partnership. Anniversaries are also a good time to sort of think about more inclusive narratives around your collections. And I always found that very powerful. I think ahead of the 250th, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR, were doing some interesting online exhibits and initiatives around underrepresented groups who were involved with the American Revolution. I thought that was really exciting. And there are a lot of great resources if you're starting to try to think about how to approach collaborations between cultural institutions. For example, the Participatory Museum, the Art of Relevance. So those are some good resources. Again, they're in the resource guide that goes along with this, that's in the training hub, where you'll also be able to get a download of these slides. And again, later on, we'll look at a case study that I think is a good representation of how you sort of bring together these benefits. And then one more benefit I want to highlight, kind of related to the access and care for your collections, is this opportunity to think about conservation work. This, could just be, conservation treatment for works you're planning on displaying, uh, items that you anticipate having increased research interest in, or materials that support your collection in other ways, or your celebration in other ways. Again, the excitement that's sort of generated around a big anniversary celebration really makes it an opportune moment to raise these funds for conservation work. So again, would it have been nice to plan for and fundraise and do conservation work ahead of the 250th year? Sure. This can also be a moment to showcase some materials that really need conservation work to do that fundraising so that you can do that work in the next few years. I still think there's a lot of opportunity around that. And we have for the last few years been doing a lot, seeing a lot of incoming work, conservation requests come in for folks planning various celebrations. Um, I also take this moment to just underline, unless you are a trained conservator, we don't recommend you attempting kind of your own at-home conservation work. Obviously, like some gentle surface cleaning, is a great idea and definitely something you can do yourself. Um, and we have a leaflet on that. But I also want to highlight that, leaving that major work to a trained professional is what's safest for your collection. If you have any questions about working with conservators, we can, of course, answer those. But I also want to point you to a free leaflet on our website about how to find and work with a conservator who's a good match for your collection, your needs, the materials you have. And so, use that leaflet, but also if you have questions, we're happy to answer them. Okay, I'm going to take a break here to take a sip of water, check the chat. So if you have any questions so far about this sort of initial cost benefit analysis, and then we'll start talking about documentation. Okay, let me make the chat bigger. Okay, Denise, I don't know if you've left already. I see your question about um, a cowhide. Um, Great question. Great preservation question. I am going to respond to you via email because I want to be able to point you towards some good resources. And I would not say we are an expert on like organic materials like a cowhide, but I'm happy to help you kind of find a good direction to go. But we'll save that for an email. But thank you for asking the question. I'll follow up. Um, Actually, now that I say that, will you? No, we have your email. Okay. Um, Brett asks, one major challenge we have in an old building is the impact of humidity. Um, what advice do you have for this on metal, paper, cloth exhibits? Um, yes. So humidity, definitely when we're thinking about exhibits, even also storage, right? Humidity is a major challenge. And really kind of bad, you've listed paper, metal, cloth exhibits, right? Increased humidity is bad for all of those in slightly different ways, but like in general, we can sort of treat them, most materials do not like a high humidity environment. And I am assuming it is high humidity, Brett, not a low humidity situation. Feel free to tell me if that's incorrect. If you're in the desert, perhaps. Um, in that case, I think really being thinking about one carefully if you already have, if you're trying to, yes, okay, exhibit materials that are particularly fragile. You have a couple examples, a couple options, right? You can either try to better the humidity of the overall exhibit space, right? If that is one room, thinking about putting in a dehumidifier in that space can be an option to help control that space better. The thing I would recommend is one, making sure you're closely monitoring that humidity if you do put in a dehumidifier. So making sure you're adding in an environmental monitor of some type that can help you track the humidity in the space. We also don't want it to go too low. You also want to be very careful if it is, ideally, right, we love a dehumidifier that will, be piped and empty itself and remove the water from the space. But if it is one where you have to manually remove the water, making sure there is a process for doing that safely to not spill the water and consistently. I think that's one of the issues is if it's a very humid space. That you can sometimes end up with a humidifier that you're emptying like twice a day. And then what if it's a day where nobody's there? We don't want to be have a bigger water issue on our hands. The other thing I would say, instead of doing the entire room, if that's not accessible, spending a little bit more time and intention around the cases themselves that you might display items in, and trying to work to create a microclimate within that space. I honestly think that can be a little bit more challenging occasionally if you don't have access to a well-sealed case, and adding something like a silica desiccant in there to help kind of control that. That can just be a little bit finicky. And again, you would need to then monitor the interior of each individual space. So it can usually be easier to try to do the whole room, but again, it depends on, that room, how well it's sealed, and your kind of your various levels of access. If you feel like it's gonna be really, really, really challenging to make an incredible improvement with either of those solutions, I would say then being very, very choosy about what materials can be exposed to that condition, how long you will have them on display. And so instead thinking about, okay, where can you instead use a facsimile, or some sort of reproduction, so that you can still have folks see things, but that you're keeping the originals in storage. Maybe bringing out the originals just for like a special like 2-hour event, something like that. Okay, we're gonna keep going. Oh my gosh, we're already 30 minutes in. We're gonna have to go a little bit faster. So planning and policies. This is my favorite thing to talk about. It's not the most interesting part sometimes of collections work and preservation work, but it is one of the most impactful, I would argue. Um, a lot of policies and procedures are things that we want to be like thinking about and taking our time and developing, maybe, in committees, or it can be a long process. So hopefully you already have lots of great policies and procedures in place. That's not always the case though. And so I have a sort of checklist here. These are all great foundational documents to have at your organization, sort of generally. But if you were saying, okay, maybe I don't have all of these, what are the things I really have to do if I'm planning to have like a really busy summer with an exhibit and a lot of requests? And I like hadn't really thought about our policies because I'm a, solo archivist and I only have so much time. I've highlighted the ones on screen that I think are most important. I think there could be an increase in donations, so a very standard deed of gift form, if you don't already have one, is critical. If you think there's a potential that you might loan an item out or somebody might loan materials to you, having some basic loan agreement information is really important. And because we're thinking about loans and also exhibiting materials, just a basic exhibit condition report. Again, these are all forms that you can copy from other organizations. They're online. But having a way to sort of, do some initial condition reporting is important. And then making sure you're tracking research access and use. This is also really, really important, not just, in terms of that vandalism theft conversation that we had earlier, but also in terms of tracking, and collecting data around the collections that folks were interested in. That is going to be information that you will continue to use past an anniversary, right? It's going to be evidence for digitization, conservation work, all sorts of grant opportunities. And so if there's one thing I could stress is coming up with a way to collect data about the access that people and what people were requesting from your collection. Yes, is it nice to have a disaster plan? And, especially this big moment. Yes, should you have a mission statement? I really hope all of you already have a mission statement in place. But again, I think a lot of those can wait past any immediate need if you were planning an event for the 250th this year. And again, in this case, don't spend too much time worrying about like the writing the perfect policy or document. Find a template online that works and use that until you have more time to revise it. So I'll just say a little bit more here about some of those topics. One is intellectual control is critical, right? If you don't know what you have, if you don't know where it is, you can't provide access, you can't prevent theft or, really do any preservation work if you don't know what items you have to preserve. And so if you are an organization that doesn't have a strong, inventory or strong intellectual control, if you have a really large backlog, especially if you're approaching a major anniversary, using that as the push to really do some inventory work is great. Obviously, if you're focus on the 250th, you don't have time for this anymore. This is really a long-term planning thing. But if you are thinking ahead to other anniversary celebrations, ensuring that you have better intellectual control, and ensuring that if you're accepting anything in this year, that you are getting that documentation. If you're getting that deed of gift that I mentioned signed, that's really critical. The same goes with exhibit policy and guidelines. This is one where I think it's great to have as you plan for exhibits around an anniversary. Is it absolutely critical to do this moment if you're planning an exhibit for, this fall? Not necessarily. Um, but it is going to be an essential document, especially for, kind of continuing best preservation, best practice over time as staff changes to ensure that, you are approaching the best environmental conditions, security, policies around how you are promoting access to your materials. And again, there are some great examples out there. We have examples of these policies in the resource guide for this webinar. And then there is the question of loans. I think right now in a last minute scenario, you don't really have time to pursue both loaning items out or take, bringing in items on loan. But it's good to know that, for anniversary exhibits in particular, this is an option. It's always an option for exhibits. But it's nice to be prepared, right? Whether you want to borrow materials to have on display for an exhibit or whether you want to lend items out to your fellow organizations. So here's some examples on screen of things that you, if you want to borrow something that you should be ready to supply, information you should have. And then on this slide, it is kind of the other side. If you're going to be lending things out, what you should be thinking about. So, you can go back to these slides to reference these. And again, there are loan policies out there that you can look at and adapt for your organization. I already mentioned condition reporting. This really should already be sort of a standard part of your procedures and collections kind of care. If you're planning exhibits, you should already be planning to do condition reporting. But particularly around, this increased handling, maybe this is part of your loan decision making, ensuring that you're taking the time to thoroughly document and photograph the current condition, any changes to condition is really going to help you focus any needed preservation work and help the decision making around whether something is safe enough to go on display in a high humidity environment or be loaned to so-and-so, down the road, things like that. We'd rather catch an issue early while it's minor and document it before it becomes a much larger issue. Because a lot of times the conservation intervention is going to be a lot cheaper if you do it while it's not a big issue before waiting till it's kind of proceeded to a really big problem. And then this is my moment to once again emphasize that preservation and access are inseparable. And so some things to think about as you're thinking about access, knowing about how you work with, especially we're thinking about researchers here. So, determining which materials are safe to be accessed by researchers, what the procedures around those are. There's a lot of documentation that can be related to this. This can be your registration form. This can be media reproduction requests, just sort of your overall reading room guidelines. Especially if you have any of these policies in place, I do recommend refreshing them with staff who actually interact with the researchers. And if you are a small historical society who's maybe never had access policy or a research registration form, just doing some research to find examples, and again, they're in the resource guide, and just starting to try to implement it is absolutely better than doing nothing. So with that, we are going to move on to talking about this kind of general handling refresher. Is going to be super, super basic, but I think it's a good reminder. I think some of us also just, this is sometimes part of our everyday job. We don't even think about some of these things that we definitely do, but great refresher for us as well as volunteer students, researchers. So let's start with the big one, of course, gloves. I think we're all familiar with the idea that sort of white cotton gloves were synonymous with how folks were handling materials in libraries and museums. Obviously, I think we also all understand that's no longer the standard recommendation. Um, Cotton gloves just have a lot of problems. They don't allow sort of sensitive handling. They are really actually hard to get truly clean, and they're going to give off lint. And so we definitely recommend using nitrile or latex gloves that you'll throw out when you're done. Um, I would also say if unless you're handling photographs or like metal objects, for most materials, especially paper-based, documents or books, clean, dry hands are appropriate and usually the safest for a lot of those things because it is going to give you the most tactile response to safely handle those materials. You just want to make sure you're not wearing jewelry on your hands. You don't have like lotion or hand sanitizer even on clean, dry hands. And of course, you want to make sure that you're using appropriate, stable supplies with your collection. So you want to be doing your labels in pencil or using archivally safe markers. Um, we want to make sure we're supporting bound volumes using book cushions, like the ones on screen, to support the books. I will say if you don't have any, book cushions, but now you're concerned about kind of appropriately supporting the spine, kind of a cheap, easy solution, is you can take a clean cotton towel. And roll it up and stick one underneath each cover. And again, that's going to give you sort of the flexibility to properly and gently support that book. And having other materials like the book snakes, which are those things kind of laying over the edge of those books. All of those are going to allow, either to gently display materials or promote that access to researchers. Um, we also want to make sure, sort of, as we approach handling our collections, that we are sort of prepared, right? So I always say you prepare yourself first before you even think about touching the collections. So again, you have those clean, dry hands. I usually recommend, I mean, it does depend on the kind of nail polish, but like your average, like regular drugstore nail polish, if it's not like a gel or a particular like lacquer, can mark your collections. And so I'm either, careful to wear gloves or just being aware of that risk if you do wear nail polish. If you have baggy shirts, tie, scarf, all of those, I just try to remove anything that can get in the way, pull back any long hair. Right. I just sort of pretend like if I'm going to handle materials, it's like I'm operating heavy duty machinery. And so I want to kind of eliminate all of those potential risks. And once I'm prepared, I'm now then preparing the workspace, right? Even if it's just a brief space, we want to make sure, brief time that we're going to use an object, we want to make sure we have that safe environment. So large flat space that's clean and empty. Some of your items may be large and heavy. So before you pick anything up, you want to sort of then consider where it's going to be going, but also do you need any assistance? Do you need another person to come help you move things safely? Um, and then you're doing a visual inspection of the object, or item so that you know where any weak points are. Is there anything that's going to be loose? How can you most safely handle it? And you're also ensuring that you have that clear, if you are walking from storage space to your workspace, that you have a clear path to do so. Again, I think it's really essential to have written handling policies that can help kind of emphasize all of these points. Um, some other tips, right? You want to use a tray or a cart to transport oversized or heavy or awkward objects from storage. And, in general, right, we're trying to be very slow and intentional with our movements. With books, we want to use our whole hand to carry the page, and support the page as well as the binding when we're doing this. If you feel like the page is unusually heavy, make sure you're, supporting items in the right area as you do so. And then books, we really want to be paying attention to the status of the binding, and kind of thinking about how much that binding and spine can really take, and how much you can safely open it. And you can see some examples here on screen of books that really just can't be opened all the way, and that are much safer having that extra support there. One last thing I want to mention, I think we probably could do a whole anniversary discussion around digitization projects specifically, because I think it's so tied to how a lot of folks are approaching an anniversary moment, and especially the 250th, because it can be such a great way to promote access. So if you are, maybe you didn't get a chance to like do a big digitization project with a big grant and a vendor, but maybe you are just, getting increased requests where you have to scan materials or doing some last minute little digital exhibit. You can do some great digitization work in-house. I do just want to, in a handling standpoint, say, if you're using a flatbed scanner, right, just ensuring that you are only putting on materials that are not damaged. We definitely don't want you to see like putting a bound volume in a flatbed scanner, things like that. But you can do a lot of great work digitizing on your own scanners. Just thinking about the handling and everything that's going to go into that is critical. Okay, I'm going to pause here for questions and a sip of water before we talk about our case study. Rachel asks, do you have any recommendations for policies regarding handling materials when you don't have a reading room space for researchers? This is a great question, Rachel, because it's a situation a lot of small organizations are in. Been to a lot of folks who have just sort of like makeshift space. They're like, oh, this is sort of where we put up the table for the researchers to work if they come. And that's totally fine. Long term, right? We would love to have dedicated sort of purpose-built space. That's just not always possible. So I think a couple of things to think about are, is again, do you have time to really think about this from a policy standpoint right now? Not necessarily. But in terms of best practice, right? Just providing a space where there is a safe workspace for the researcher to interact with materials. So, right, a table that is, an appropriate size for the material they're accessing. We don't want a tiny table and then a big oversized blueprint that folks are trying to look at that's, hanging off the edges or there's no room for a notebook. And then the really most important thing is that it's a space that you can supervise. What we don't want is folks being set up in a tiny room and then you not having the ability to watch and work while they do their work as well. So the two main things are just a safe space. Ideally, right, we want a space that even if it's okay if there's a bit of light, right, because there's kind of limited light exposure for the duration while they're using the materials. Um, but ideally it's not like they're going to the most humid, hot room at a place to do this work. So just thinking of all of those things we want in terms of like stable environment, safe, open area to do the work and supervisable essentially. So that there's no risk of damage happening to your collections. Okay. Great questions. I will say as we're sort of getting close here to the end, if we don't get to everyone's questions, um, absolutely, I'm happy to stay on a little late to answer questions, and you can also email me. Okay. So one quick case study here, I think that's a good example, is the Alabama Bicentennial, which this was quite a few years ago now. This was 2018. But we helped do conservation work on the state of Alabama's 6 constitutions. And this was a really great example because this was coming from both the Alabama Department of Archives and History, but also their legislature and also a special bicentennial committee. So it was a big state initiative that was bringing, a lot of different organizations and community members together. And there was a lot of great, educational resources and kind of exhibits that were going around this specific item in this anniversary. And so this is a picture of the constitutions as they were approaching treatment. Here's some pictures of them being not only treated here, but also sort of like, stabilized for exhibition, but also creating some digitization of it as well, so that that could be shared digitally as well as in person. Um, and then they did this really great touring exhibit at the end. That was a really brief summary of that. It's an interesting case study, but we do have an entire article written on it on our website. So if you're interested in sort of like getting into the nitty-gritty of that, you can go on the website. I don't want to kind of continue to dig too into it too deeply today because I'm conscious of our time and I want to be able to look at the checklist with you all. So I have these great planning checklists that were really designed again for folks kind of, approaching an anniversary celebration with a lot of time to plan. And so if you are still, planning for an upcoming, anniversary that's happening next year or the year after, great, read the entire checklist. But again, if you're approaching the 250th or any other kind of relevant anniversary this year, something that you want to do in the next few months or half a year, I've tried to sort of triage a little bit and highlight what I think are some of the most important things to consider ahead of a big anniversary. I'm not going to read all of these, but I just want, again, the highlighted things here on screen. And these are things we sort of talked about, right? But doing a refresh on handling for any of your staff or volunteers, you could even just show them the recorded portion of today's webinar if you want. Um, but going over that is absolutely a critical step, I think. Um, Thinking a bit strategically about funding, right? Again, you probably don't have time to adjust budgets or apply for grants, but thinking about how you want to solicit or run any fundraising campaigns, this is a great opportunity, especially with the grant landscape being so complicated right now. It is a really great opportunity to approach kind of more creative, crowdsourced fundraising opportunities. And so still something I encourage you to think about no matter what stage in the game you're at. Um, in terms of intellectual control, again, increased finding aids, inventories, all of that is great. If you have time to do some reorganization, that's great. But if you're only going to be able to do one thing related to your intellectual control, it's ensuring that you have an up-to-date deed of gift that everybody understands needs to be filled out. That's the other thing is like I've been in the the instance where I've worked at a museum where folks would accept items, I run the collections, but somebody else at the organization is accepting a donation on my behalf and not getting the paperwork filled out, right? So ensuring that everyone understands how critical that piece of document is, and that you have one in place. These are related to your exhibits, right? So again, you probably don't have time to do a full policy if you don't have an existing exhibit policy, but just making sure that you understand how long you plan to exhibit materials and what conditions they're going to be under, and making sure you know who can safely, help you install an exhibit, right? What are your best volunteers or staff members who can help you do that is going to be really important. And then also doing a quick look at what your lighting situation is, because it is actually very easy if you are using some legacy incandescent bulbs to switch to LED at this moment. That's not an impossible to-do list to improve your exhibit. And that's switching to an LED bulb is going to be an incredibly useful preservation action. Or just say, okay, yes, we would love to like put filters on these windows, but instead we're going to just kind of put up temporary curtains, for example. There are sort of those kind of last minute mitigation techniques that maybe aren't like the long-term thing you want, but in terms of protecting these collections is going to be okay. Maybe it is even, excuse me, even just covering a case, like putting a covering on a case so that you're limiting that light exposure. They can be really simple ways, things like that too. And then finally, access and handling. This is a lot of what we were just discussing, but coming up with the kind of policies and instructions so that collections are handled safely by both your staff and your patrons is so important. And if you can develop any guidelines around, photocopying, copyright, that's like a bonus, I would say. And it'll just make your life a lot easier. Okay, so to sum it up, some last minute recommendations. Things that I think I've hit along the webinar here, but I just want to emphasize. One is that, you all as the folks who are working with your collections, I want you all to be the voice of your collection, right? Your job is to be the advocate for the preservation of your collection. I know that you can be put in tricky situations where kind of the firm no that you want to give is not necessarily possible. But you want to fall back on the fact that you have an ethical responsibility for the care of these collections in your stewardship, right? You have a code of ethics that you are following as an archivist, as a museum professional, as a librarian. And so lean on those when you're trying to have really challenging conversations with the, director of advancement, the chair of the board, and all of these folks who are asking for things. Especially, I think they're the ones who love to make a last minute ask because they don't truly always understand the implications for the collection. So that is your job, right? In this situation is to be that voice. That means it's always your job, but I think it's particularly important here. Also know that you don't have to do this alone. Ask for help. Reach out to us to ask for preservation advice. Reach out to your local colleagues. There are folks out there who are going through the same thing. There's great resources out there. And so, asking, especially when you don't know, asking a trusted colleague or expert is always a good choice. You can email us any preservation question at info@nedcc.org. We'll help either, get you to a conservator or to a preservation specialist that has the information you need or point you to the right person who does. We already talked about this, but really this is the moment for partnerships, lessen this workload, build new community connections. This is, even with organizations you've maybe never worked with before. Ooh, I'm not done. Hold on. And then documentation, 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 right? That was a big part of our conversation today, ensuring that you have those documents up to date. Um, and then I also think don't feel pressured to do anything last minute just because you feel like you're supposed to. I know that everyone here, every organization is understaffed to a degree. More anniversaries come, right? There are other opportunities, especially around the 250th. There are other major anniversaries coming related to the American Revolution, related to the founding of the country. And that may just not be a good mission fit for your organization. So, you don't have to force something. There might be other people telling you you do. So it's not like I can say that. But I think if you are in the leadership person who's trying to make a decision right now around this, I think, giving yourself the space to plan, have more time to plan for a different kind of anniversary celebration is perfectly fine. I want to point out one great resource. I mean, there's a lot of great resources in our resource guide, but in particular, if you said, wow, Jesse just gave so much great information, but I know so-and-so is never going to watch this recording of the webinar. We do have this lovely leaflet. We have lots of great preservation leaflets. You should be using those. But in particular, 1.7 is on celebrating with collections. And so it sort of distills all of the kind of fun things I discussed today into 2 short pages. I think it's 2. Maybe it's 3, but it's not more than that. And that's something you can give to volunteers, you can give to board members. You can use yourself as quick reference about these topics. So with that, it is 1:27, and I did not leave enough time, unfortunately, to do this brainstorming activity. So you will get to take this sort of away with you. I would say if you have another 10 minutes that you get to spend, you can look at these slides and come back to these questions. But I think if you're trying to figure out where to start an activity like this, where you're thinking about your kind of goals, your obstacles, your assets, and trying to identify some initial action items, can be a really useful exercise. So you can come back to these slides for those. We don't really have time to share out. So I'm just going to go to my last slide. Happy to answer questions. Also, in addition, on the hub where you're going to find the slides, where you're going to find the resource guide, you will also find a survey. So I really appreciate feedback on this webinar. We'll probably continue to teach this even past the 250th, because I think it is a great kind of brainstorm around anniversary moments. But if you have other things you'd like covered, happy to hear that in the survey. I'm also going to paste my email into the chat. So if you want to email, if you email info@nedcc about this webinar, it'll get sent to me. But if you want to just email me directly, it's in the chat. So let me look to see if there's any questions. Thank you all for that amount of information we just packed into 1 hour. Okay. We talked about high humidity. We talked about that. Okay. Checklist. Okay. Do you have advice for sole collection workers trying to communicate with volunteer communities who are willing to follow preservation and exhibit policies, particularly when there is a parent organization encouraging you to compromise? It's a great question. I know in particular from experience how challenging volunteers in particular can be, right? We love volunteers. We can't do the work without them usually. But they can have all different backgrounds and experiences and perspectives around the collections. And so there's 2 things. Trying to re-emphasizing why it's so important why the best practices are the way they are, pointing them to resources. So it's not you reiterating, so you sharing other resources where they can hear you, the thing you've been saying to them said in another way can be really useful. Um, and then I think beyond that, trying to that's where policies and guidelines can really actually be helpful because instead of it just being like you who says it, if you have a policy that is sort of official, right, officially approved by your board, by your organization's leadership, um, it's not you saying, "Hey, I don't want you to crumple that piece of paper every time you touch it." It's you saying, "We actually have this policy in place. We have to adhere to the policies. I know policies are no fun, but we have to follow them." And then having a real ability to say if that's not working, if you have an established policy and your volunteers can't meet that expectation, um yeah, trying to figure out who what is there anybody above you who can help um redirect their energy, maybe there's another volunteer activity that's more appropriate for them, or reiterate the expectation essentially. And sometimes none of those are possible, unfortunately. And so um it can feel like a really fruitless battle. But I think continuing to try to emphasize and doing any documentation that you can or being strategic, maybe partnering them with a volunteer who does understand better. There's like a peer that they can hear it from. Maybe that helps. But yeah, I'm sorry, that's really challenging. Any other questions? Okay. Not seeing any immediate questions, and we are at time. So I'm gonna wrap us up here. I'm gonna stop recording.